few weeks ago, a friend of mine asked in a group chat if any of us had heard of Dan Ariely because she had just heard about his first book, Predictably Irrational, and she wanted to know if it was any good. So I actually bought that book when it first came out, and I had read it. And so I replied, it's an entertaining book, though, like all pop psychology stuff, it makes a lot of unsupported leaps, a lot of weird, fun studies that have probably never been reproduced. Well, what are the chances? Because just a week or two later, the news hit that one of Ariely's studies has been retracted due to evidence of fraud. Whoops. Okay, here's the background. Ariely is a behavioral economist, essentially economics, but as it is affected by human behavior, humans with all of their weird human psychology. And he has a really cool and sympathetic backstory, as he described in his first book, Predictably Irrational. He said that he got interested in this sort of applied psychology when he experienced a really severe accident as a teenager that resulted in him being covered in extensive, painful burns across most of his body. During his recovery, he says that he became interested in how to better treat patients in horrible situations like his. So he started doing these studies that were, it turns out, very well timed because pop psychology was just starting to have a moment. Like, you know, those studies that are like, what if instead of charging a set price for a slice of pizza, you made people pay a small fee for every bite they take? Turns out they hate it. Science. Okay, I'm being glib, but I really did enjoy and learn a lot from his research. Like this study published in JAMA in a letter in 2008 that found that if you sell someone a useless sugar pill for whatever ails them, it will work better if they think it costs more money. They did this by giving 80 people a fake painkiller pill and then shocking them, like literally shocking them with electricity. Half of the people thought that they were taking an expensive pill and the other half thought they were taking a discounted pill. The expensive group thought that the shocks hurt less compared to the discounted group. See? Fascinating. And it fits in with what we know or what we think we know or want to think we know about human nature. Why do people pay so much for Gwyneth Paltrow's bullshit, for instance? And why do they keep paying even after trying it once? Because surely they would see that they got ripped off. But no, this suggests that maybe the price they're paying actually makes them feel less like they're getting ripped off. But is it true? Well, other studies have supported it, like this paper from 2013 that found that patients who took a generic version of a drug compared to a branded version of a drug experienced more negative side effects and lower overall effectiveness. I'm side-eyeing those error bars a bit, but hey, even a small result is an interesting result that supports that previous study. But it's still not a replication in which ideally a new researcher does the exact same study to see if they get the exact same results. Which brings us to a study that Ariely was a co-author on, published in 2012 in PNAS, titled Signing at the Beginning Makes Ethics Salient and Decreases Dishonest Self-Reports in Comparison to Signing at the End. The crux was this. Is there a simple way to get people to be honest when you have no real way to easily check that they're being honest? For instance, the IRS doesn't know if you're being honest when you file your taxes each year until they have a chance to closely examine your return and other documents. And with so many taxpayers, that takes a lot of time and money and energy. So if there's a way to just get people to be more honest on their own, then it might be worthwhile for them to do whatever that takes. In the case of the tax return, the IRS has you sign your return at the end, promising that you've been truthful. Ariely et al. Thought that maybe people would be more likely to be honest if they sign that declaration at the beginning of their return, Because, for instance, by reading out that honesty declaration and signing it, you might be more likely to spend your time filling out the return thinking about that declaration and thinking about how honest you are. Even if that thought is lurking in the back of your subconscious, it might actually make you more likely to be honest. This is a similar concept to research exploring our inherent biases that screw us up. Some studies have suggested that if students have to mark down whether they're male or female before a math test, women are more likely to do worse because merely calling to mind that they're a woman could also call to mind all of the biases associated with being a woman, like how women aren't as good as men at math. So this is sort of similar. To test the honesty hypothesis, Ariely and his team conducted a few experiments in the lab, like having subjects take a quiz where they have the opportunity to cheat for financial gain. They found that subjects who had signed their name at the top, pledging to be honest, cheated less often than those who signed at the bottom or who didn't have to sign anything at all. Then came a field study in which they solicited help from a car insurance company. They had the company's customers fill out a form with their odometer readings and had them sign either at the top or at the bottom, indicating that they were being honest. Driving fewer miles would result in lower insurance premiums, so they had a financial incentive to lie. They also had a previous odometer reading from these same customers that the company already had on file. They found that customers who signed at the top of the form reported more than 10% more miles driven than those who signed at the end. And considering that they surveyed more than 13,000 customers, that's a pretty solid result. And so for the past 10 years, this paper has been cited repeatedly by other researchers. It's been incorporated into corporate policies around the world and even been considered by governments in regards to things like tax documents. It's been very influential. But in March of 2020, there was an update. 3 of the original researchers, which did not include Dan Ariely, tried to replicate the findings of that initial paper, first in the lab. They redid that same you can cheat for financial gain quiz, but instead of using 100 subjects like they did in the first study, they used 4,559 people. And with that much larger number of participants, they saw the effect completely disappear. It didn't matter whether the respondents signed at the beginning or the end or on their own foreheads. They all lied or told the truth at approximately the same rate. Well, that sucks, they probably said. If it doesn't actually work in the lab, what about that field experiment? So they went back and they looked at the original data and they realized that their 2 groups, signed at the top, signed at the bottom, weren't equivalent. The group that signed at the top already drove more miles compared to the group that signed at the bottom. So the difference between them wasn't because the top signers were telling the truth about driving more. It was that they actually were driving more compared to the people who signed at the bottom. The people who signed at the bottom actually were driving less. All the initial authors, Ariely included, signed a statement published in Scientific American saying, hey, our bad. Turns out this top signing thing is not real. So there we have it, a wholesome story about scientists going back to actually replicate their own findings, getting a negative result, and then coming clean about it. That's how science is supposed to work. Awesome. But wait, there's more. After they published that letter in Scientific American, other anonymous researchers had some questions. Like, okay, you randomly split 13,000 people into 2 different groups to measure their self-reported mileage, and you just happened to accidentally have one group that drove way more miles than the other half? I mean, sure. It could happen accidentally, but maybe we should take a closer look at that data. Luckily, the researchers who found all this in 2020 published all of the data. So other researchers downloaded it and took a look. And what they found was sus. Are we still saying sus? Were we ever saying sus? Anyway, the data definitely killed a crew member and then escaped through a vent. When the anonymous researchers plotted the data from the original field experiment, they found that the distribution was weird as heck. Here's what you might expect to see. Most people drive 5,000 to 10,000 miles. And by the way, this is actual data. And then the number drops off on either side of that. Fewer drive 2,000 to 5,000 miles and 10,000 to 15,000 miles. And even fewer drive 250 to 2,000 miles and 15 to 20, and so on. But the data from the 2012 study showed that each category of miles driven had almost exactly the same frequency. There are exactly as many people who drove 10,000 miles as who drove 20, 30, 40, and 50,000 miles across 13,488 random people. That's weird. The anonymous researchers also found that in the initial odometer readings already on file with the insurance company, a lot of people clearly just rounded their readings. So say if their odometer said 9,043 miles, they would just say it was at 9,000 miles because who cares? And you can tell that because those nice rounded numbers show up more frequently in the data set. Guess what was different about the second data set? That's right, round numbers were not any more frequent. 9,043 was reported exactly as often as 9,000. Weird if we're talking about the same humans who were totally fine rounding on their first take. Not weird if we're talking about, a random number generator. There are more anomalies, as reported over on Data Colada, like strong evidence that the initial data set was also manipulated using a random number generator, but that should be enough for you to understand their conclusion. This wasn't just a mistake, this was fraud. Fraud on whose part, though? Well, of the 5 authors of the initial paper, it is the 4th author who all agree is the only person who handled the car insurance data. That 4th author? Dan Ariely. Ariely responded to the post on Data Colada with a brief note, pinning the blame entirely on the insurance company. Well, not entirely. He does say that he did not test the data for irregularities, which, after this painful lesson, I will start doing regularly. That leaves us with a few options here for what really happened. If we take Ariely at his word, if he's honest, which, he did sign his letter at the end, but that means that someone at the insurance company decided to not bother typing in all of the real data they collected from their customers, which they had obviously done in the past. So this wasn't a ridiculous request. And instead, they went and found a random number generator to create all of the data out of thin air and then populate that. Then they went back to their original data set of existing information, and then they duplicated them while making the mistake of switching the font from Cambria to Calibri, which is how the anonymous reviewers first noticed that the data set was duplicated. And then they added a random number between 1 and 1,000 to exactly half of those baseline reported mileages. Adding that random number to half the data set resulted in approximately 10% of an increase on that half of the data set in their reported mileages compared to the other half, which just so happens to exactly confirm the hypothesis of the researchers, which the employee at the insurance company would surely not have known in order to be properly blinded. The evil insurance company employee then packed up all of that fixed data and sent it to Dan Ariely, who for some reason decided to not do a single basic check on the data to be sure it looked right, and who then simply went ahead and published. That's one option. The other option, Dan Ariely made up the data to fit his hypothesis. You can decide for yourself which of those is the most plausible, but before I leave you to it, consider this other reply from one of the other co-authors of the 2012 study, Max Blazerman. He looked over the data analysis and said he agrees that data is clearly fraudulent. He goes on to say, there were indications of problems from the start, 2011. The first time I saw the combined 3-study paper was on February 23, 2011. On this initial reading, I thought I saw a problem with implausible data in Study 3. I raised the issue with a co-author and was assured the data was accurate. I continued to ask questions because I was not convinced by the initial responses. When I eventually met another co-author responsible for this portion of the work at a conference, I was provided more plausible explanations and felt more confidence in the underlying data. I would note that this co-author quickly showed me the data file on a laptop. I did not, nor did I have others, examine the data more carefully. So if you were leaning towards the evil car insurance employee hypothesis, then you should also accept the fact that in this case, in the very best light, Dan Ariely is completely inept at his job. Not only did he not test the data for irregularities, but according to his co-author, when those irregularities were pointed out to him early in the process, he dismissed them and reassured his co-author that the data was accurate, despite having not tested it. I love not being sued, so I won't tell you whether I think Dan Ariely is an out-and-out fraud or simply too stupid and incompetent to look at the data his own co-author thinks is suspicious before publishing it. I just know that I won't be buying his books anymore.